In this video, you will learn what variables and data types are in computer programming and how to use those in Python. Welcome! I'm Cons. I got a master's degree in computer science and currently work as a graduate research assistant where I work with Python on a daily basis. And I'm here to help you to learn Python. After you've written your first Python program, for which you can find a video up here, it is time to talk about variables. Variables in computer programs are used to store, manipulate and label data. You can imagine a variable as a container where you can store data in. In this container you can store text, numbers or even more complex things. And if you have stored something in a variable in your program, you can later access this data by just stating the variable's name. But this is enough of this theoretical talk. Let's jump right into VS Code and check out how we can use variables in Python. So over here I have a program fragment which is just the name equals main, which we have seen in our first video, which states that this is part of the main program. Then I'm going to enter my first variable, and the variable I would like to have is called a, and I would like to store the value 42 in it. This is also called a variable assignment. First I have the name of the variable, then I have an equal sign, and then the value I would like to store in it. So over here we store the value 42 in the variable named a. And we can do this with as many variables we would like. So we are going to state a second variable which is called b equals 23. And then I'm going to state a third variable which is called c. But this time I'm not going to assign a explicit value to our variable, but I will assign the result of a calculation to it. So we're going to use a multiplied by b and store that in C. This means that first we read the value 42 from variable a, then we read the value 23 from variable b, multiply them together, and then store the result in our variable c. And to retrieve the result from our calculation from the variable c, we're going to enter a print statement. Enter print c colon and then a comma c. We use Ctrl F5 to execute our program in VS Code, and we can see down here that the result of 42 multiplied with 23 is 966. The value stored in a variable can also be changed. So we're going to enter a once again, and this time we're going to assign the value 89 to it. And when we now print our a colon with a print statement over here and run that, we can see that a now holds the value 89. However, this will not change the value of c, because c is assigned over here and the values of a, which was then 42 multiplied by b, 23, is still stored in c. And we can have a look at that as well. We have a second look at c. We run our program and we can see c hasn't changed its value even though we have changed a. And if this video was helpful for you so far, make sure to hit the like button so that it can spread to even more people and even more people can start to learn Python. Now that we have seen how to assign values to variables and how to retrieve those values again, it is time to talk about naming variables. In computer science, naming variables is very important. Every time you will introduce a new variable, make sure to pick a good name that precisely describes what is stored in that variable. The reason for that is that when you give the code to someone else or you look at the code at a later stage, it is not always clear what that variable describes. So make sure to give a variable a name that everyone can understand what is stored in that variable. To give you an example on how to pick a good variable name for your programs, we're going to write a program which stores information on a pet. And the first thing we would like to enter in this program is a variable that stores what species our pet is. So we're going to introduce a variable species, and we're going to have a cat. Then it is important to know what breed this cat is. So we enter breed, and it should be a British short hair. And it's also interesting what color our cat has, so we're going to introduce another variable called color, and the color for this cat, which we can see down here, is chocolate. Then it is also important to know what sex the pet is. So we're going to enter that. And it is a male cat. And the name of the cat is Mr. Fluffers. Another important thing about your pet is how old it is. And for that we're going to introduce another variable, we call it age. And we won't just call it age, we will actually call it age years with an underscore, because we are going to store the age of this cat as years. And this cat is 7 years old. Another important health factor for your pet is its weight. So for that we're going to introduce a variable weight, and we also state here that we would like to store the weight in kilograms. And this cat is 6.1 kilograms. And we would also like to store what the favorite toy and the favorite food of our pet is. For that we're going to introduce two more variables. Favorite toy, and that's a plushy mouse. And the favorite food is, who would have thought, tuna. And the last thing we would like to store is if the pet is currently sleeping. That we're going to introduce the variable sleeping, and our cat is mostly sleeping, so we enter true. Now that we have stored this information on our pet, we can use it to generate text blocks on our pet to describe our pet. And for that we're going to use another print statement. We enter the name, comma, is a, which means that first we print out the name, then we print out this text is a, we print out the sex, the breed, and the species. And when we run that, we can see down here the text Mr. Fluffers is a male British short-haired cat. We can go even further with that and enter important information that a vet might want to know. So over here we have name has a color is age, years old, and weighs that and that many kilograms. And when we press on Control 5, we can see Mr. Fluffers has a chocolate color, is 7 years old, and weighs 6.1 kilograms. You can enter anything you would like. Maybe you have a dog, maybe you have a mouse, maybe you have something completely different you would like to enter here. But this is one way to name your variables precisely. So every variable has a name that describes actually what is stored in it. And then we can retrieve the values from those variables in those print statements to generate those text blocks. When talking about variables in Python, it is also important to note that there are certain rules how you can name your variable. A variable always has to start with a letter or an underscore. A variable cannot start with a number. A variable can only contain the letters A to Z in capital or non-capital form, the numbers 0 to 9, and an underscore. A variable is case sensitive. That means the variable cat, cat, and cat are different variables. And a variable cannot have the name of a reserved keyword in Python. You can see a list of all reserved Python keywords here on screen. Precise variable names are crucial to improve the readability of your programs. But even more critical are comments. Comments are statements in your code that aren't executed when you run your program. And they help to describe what your program does. If you want to add a single line comment in your program to describe a certain part of your program, you just enter a pound or hash symbol and then type some text. So here we would like to describe that the 4 print statements below us will print out important information on our pet. So we write generates text block on your pet. You can also enter multi-line comments without having a pound or hash symbol in front of every line. For that we are going to use triple double quotes. So we start this line with triple double quotes, and our editor already knows that we would like to enter a multi-line comment, so we press enter. And in here we could enter a multi-line comment which describes the program overall. So we're going to state this program stores important information on your pet and will generate a short text on your pad. And this is how you enter a comment. But comments are not only used to describe your program. Comments are also very important if something goes wrong in your program and you would like to figure out what it is. So you can also use the comments to disable certain statements in your program. For example, if we don't want to print the first 2 lines here, we just enter 2 pound or hash symbols in front. And we also don't want the variables up here to be used in our program. So we're going to enter a multi-line comment around species, breed, and color. And if we run this program with Control F5, we can see it only prints out the 2 lower print statements down here because the 2 upper print statements aren't used as they are commented out. And also the variables we have commented out here aren't used in our program. But be aware that if you comment out a variable assignment you later use in your program either doesn't work or presents you with the wrong result. So if I comment out the name of our pet here, Mr. Fluffers, and run the program again, Control F5, we can see that we have a name error, and the name is not defined. So the program down here, also the editor tells us that they are looking for the variable name and where it is defined, and as we have commented it out, it is no longer part of the program. And therefore we get an error down here that name is not defined. So if we comment that back in, name will be defined again, and when we run it we can see it works again. In this example you have seen how to store text in a variable, how to store integer numbers in a variable, how to store decimal numbers in a variable, and how to store true and false statements in a variable. And those 4 make up the primitive data types of Python. The names of those 4 primitive data types in Python are integer, or short int, which stores all integer numbers like -1, 0, or -2305. The next one are floating point, or short float, which stores every number that has a decimal point like -42.23 or 0.5. The name float is derived from how such a number is stored in a computer, and I'm going to talk about that in a later video. The next one is string, that stores single letters or whole text in a variable, and those have to be enclosed in single quotes or double quotes. And the last one is boolean, or short bool, which stores either that a statement is true or false. In other programming languages like C or Java, the data type of a variable has to be explicitly stated, and the variable can only store that kind of data in it. However, Python is easy and therefore doesn't have an explicit type system, but rather a dynamic type system. That means the type of a variable is decided, or to be sound extra fancy, inferred when a value is assigned to that variable. You can actually check the type of a variable in Python by using the statement type. In our pad program, we're going to check what type our variables are, and for that we're going to use a print, and in that print we're going to use a type statement, and in that type statement we enter the variable name for which we would like to check the type. So the first variable we would like to check is species. We enter species, then we check another one, we enter age, years, then we would like to check what type of variable is weight, kg, and last but not least we're going to check what type is the variable sleeping. And when we run this program, Control F5, we can see that our first statement, which is the species, returns that our variable is of type string, or short str. The second variable, which is the age in years, is an integer. The third one, which is the weight, which we have stored in kilograms, is a float. And the last one, which states if our pet is sleeping or not, is a bool. Values of different data types can also be converted into other data types. The technical term for this conversion is called casting. Casting an integer into a float almost always happens implicitly. And we're going to have a look at that in the Python interactive mode. So open a terminal and enter Python 3 to enter the interactive mode, and then we're going to define a variable a, which we assign the number 1 to, and we can see when we enter type a, this is an integer. Then we're going to create a variable b, which will hold the value 2, and we can also enter type b here and see it is also an integer. Now we're going to define a variable c, and we're going to divide a by b. And now the implicit casting happens. While a is an integer and b is an integer, 1 divided by 2 is 0.5, which is not an integer number. This is a decimal number. And Python knows that and implicitly sets the type for c to float. So we enter c and then type c. We can see c is a float and c holds the value 0.5. Implicit casts also work with booleans, as booleans are usually stored in a computer as ones and zeros, while 1 represents true and 0 represents false. So we're going to create a variable t, which holds the value true, and when we check the type of t, we can see that it is bool. Then we are going to define a variable f, which we are going to assign false to. You can also see the type of f, which is also bool. And now we're going to create an integer variable I holding the value 10. If we now multiply I with t, we should get another integer. So we're going to define the variable it and assign it I times t. And when we look at it, we see it is 10, and the type of it is integer. So in this multiplication, t is interpreted as 1, and when we multiply 1 and 10, we will get 10 again. We can also merge strings and integers with implicit casts. For that, we're going to define a new variable L, which holds the letter A, which is of type string, of course. We're going to define the variable I, which holds the value 10, which is of type integer. And then we can define a variable S, where we multiply L with I. And now it's interesting what has happened. S is just A multiplied by I. And this is an implicit cast where we cast I to string. And then we multiply the string that was stored in L. And we can also check the type of S, which is string. But you don't have to rely on implicit casts to convert a data type into another one. And in most programming languages, you shouldn't rely on implicit casts because bugs resulting from implicit casts are very hard to find and debug. And for that, explicit casts exist. And in accordance with the Zen of Python, explicit is better than implicit. You should always use an explicit cast to make your program more readable to others and to yourself. And the explicit casts in Python are easy to remember because they have the same name as the data type itself. So the first explicit cast we have a look at is integer, which converts a floating point number into an integer number. So we enter int, open parentheses, then we enter either a variable name that holds a floating point number, or we enter a floating point number itself. So we enter 42.78, and this will result in converting this floating point number into an integer number. You might be surprised that this doesn't result in 43, but an integer cast always discards the number after the decimal point. The next one would be a floating point cast, where we can convert an integer number to a floating point, which is kinda useless in most terms, but here we're going to convert the integer number 3 into 3.0, which is the float representation of the integer 3. The next explicit cast is the string statement, so we enter str, which stands for string, and then we can enter any number we would like a floating point, and it will turn this floating point number into a string. And the last one we were going to have a look at is the bool cast, and here we can enter a variable or a number or even a string and convert that to a boolean. And we're going to convert number 23 to a boolean, which will result in true. And if we want to get false as a result, we have to enter a 0. So if we enter bool and then a floating point 0, we will get false. And the same is true when we enter bool and a integer 0 will also get false. All the number data types integer, float and boolean can be cast into each other. I can cast an integer to a boolean, I can cast a boolean to a floating point, I can cast a floating point into an integer, and so on. An exception is the string cast. We cannot cast a string into a number because there's no one-to-one relationship between a string and the number. However, we can cast a string into a boolean. So we define a string s that contains the string test, and we can cast that to bool, and we can see it results in true. Actually, every text that contains at least one letter will be cast to boolean true. The only string that will be cast to false is the string that doesn't hold any letters, which is the empty string. So we define s as an empty string here, and we cast that to bool. We can see it results in false. However, we cannot cast the string into an integer. So if we define s as test and then do an int cast, we can see this will result in an error. And we can also try it with a float, and this will also result in an error. So we can only cast a string to a bool, or you can cast numbers into a string, but not the other way around. Casting variables into different data types concludes this video. You've seen how to assign values to variables, how to retrieve the value that is stored in a variable, how to properly name a variable, what the primitive data types in Python are, and how to cast those data types into different data types. And I encourage you to play around with everything you have seen in this video, because trying out things yourself is the best way to learn something. I hope this video was helpful for you and you now understand what variables in computer programs and especially in Python are. And if you got any questions on this video, let me know down below in the comments, and join my Discord server if you want to catch up with me. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you get notified if I release another YouTube video about programming and computer science on this channel. Big shout out to my Patreon subscribers for their support, and you can find part 3 of this programming tutorial over here. And with that, I wish you a fantastic day and bye bye!